The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Donald Kerwin of the Center for Migration Studies on what America stands to gain by keeping the door open to refugees. Democracy theorist Danielle Allen on why equality is at the core of the American idea. Plus, Peter Ogburn, sitting in for Bill Press, talks with Kaili Joy Gray of Shareblue Media on the week's good news and bad news in politics and why giving up is not an option. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Donald Kerwin is a national authority on immigration who says, America and the world only stands to lose when refugees are turned away. And we say hello to Donald Kerwin, Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies. Don Kerwin, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome back to the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be with you.
Always our pleasure to talk with you as well. You know, since we last spoke several months ago, tremendous changes have happened in terms of the president's immigration agenda. We'll get to the big picture in a moment, but first we want to talk about the impact of some of the more recent events, beginning with the Supreme Court upholding the travel ban. Now, over a year ago, you wrote about this policy as being particularly ineffective in its goal to protect the nation. Still feeling that way?
Yes, I do still feel that way. I don't think that the list of countries that was obviously chosen based on the fact that a number of these countries are Muslim-majority countries actually reflects the risks that might be present to the United States. And I don't think that the refugee program, period, is a risk to the United States. I think that what's particularly disappointing to me is that the Supreme Court is not looking behind the national security claims of the administration. And it's basically saying that this is a facially neutral policy denying certain people the privilege of admissions. But that language of national security, if you do scratch the surface of it, it's language that's been used to marginalize people. And there's not a justification for it in this case. And as you look at kind of populations that have actually at different times where people have come in and done harm to the United States, they're not reflected in these populations. So I think that that's a disappointing decision, to say the least. And and the other point that I would make, I guess, is that refugee protection overall is something that furthers national security very, very significantly. Any act of refugee protection, from addressing the causes of refugee-producing situations to actually making conditions safe in the home country so people can return, to resettling them in third countries, to allowing them to integrate into the host communities in which they find themselves. All of those things further protection. So this whole notion of kind of somehow that this list of countries furthers national security, I just don't buy it.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned some of the reasons why people are seeking refuge. Several weeks ago, Attorney General Jeff Sessions ruled that immigration judges cannot consider domestic abuse and gang violence as grounds for granting asylum, which left me shaking my head. How big is this change to pre-existing policy, and what's the potential impact on asylum seekers?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite clear that what they're trying to do is they're trying to create barriers to political asylum for mostly at this point Central Americans from the Northern Triangle states. And they're trying to dissuade people who have legitimate asylum claims from coming to the United States. So it's really this decision. I would view it as a way to deter people with real fear of persecution and violence in their home states from actually even trying to come to the United States. And it is true that a lot of the asylum cases that come out of that region are based on threats and real viable threats of violence and persecution from gang members that the government can't control, or that maybe it doesn't want to control in some cases, because there is complicity in some cases between these criminal enterprises and government agents. And so I think that in particular, and also the domestic violence claims that have surfaced that are quite horrific in countries where there's really no meaningful recourse to women who and others who are exposed to domestic violence, that it really hurts kind of people that have these types of claims, and there's significant numbers of them coming from these particular states. So I think it's a bad decision that the Attorney General actually referred to himself and made, and the reason that it was made, I think, was solely to deter people from coming to the United States to seek asylum.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, the list of countries being denied temporary protected status is growing. Liberia and Honduras have now been added to the list, which includes Haiti, Nicaragua, Sudan, El Salvador, and Nepal. At this point, how many people are now affected by losing temporary protected status, and what are they facing in the immediate future?
It's pretty much the whole program has been gutted and eviscerated. And this is a program that applies to people who are in the United States and already in the United States. So it's not a magnet that draws other people here. And it's people that can't return to their home countries because it's unsafe, or because of natural disaster, or for conditions that make it impossible for them to return home. And, they've now pulled the rug out from 200,000 Salvadorans and 57,000 Hondurans and 50,000 Haitians and smaller numbers from the other countries you mentioned, as well as Liberians who had deferred and forced departure for a 20-year period. And so the actual TPS is going to expire in 2019 or early 2020 for these various groups, and they have to decide now whether they're going to try to renew temporary protected status for a final time. And they're, in some cases, are renewing at very, very low rates because they're fearful that if they do renew, that they're going to be subject to deportation once their time in the country is up. And so what they're doing is, either making that judgment at this point on whether to renew, or trying to find some other possible way to stay in the United States through some other means. But temporary protected status doesn't lead to anything necessarily. You'd have to find some other way, like a family claim or whatever it might be, to stay here. And so they're really faced with this extraordinary challenge. Do you go underground if you can't find a way to stay, or do you return home to your country that you haven't seen for 20 years with children who almost certainly in some of these countries will be at extraordinary risk? So it's really a Hobson's choice that these people face, and these are long-term members of our communities and contributing members of our communities, and it's a terrible thing for them, but it's also awful for the communities that are affected.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Donald Kerwin, Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies, here on the America's Democrats podcast. Don, recently you wrote an article in The Economist titled "How America's Refugee Policy is Damaging to the World and to Itself." You explain what we gain as a nation by keeping our doors open to refugees. Beginning with economics, what do we lose when we don't?
Well, what we did is we looked at refugees who had arrived from 1987 through 2016. And our pool of refugees was 1.1 million, so it was a very large group, and we compared different refugee populations to non-refugees, to the total foreign-born population, and to the total U.S. population. And I think the most striking thing that we found was that the refugees that had arrived earlier, from 1987 to 1996, they basically do as well as the total U.S. population, which consists mostly of citizens. So these are people that arrive with nothing, basically, and after, a period of time, they're exceeding the total population in median personal income and home ownership and rates of college education, in, access to a computer and the internet, and health insurance coverage, and on and on. And so this is a population that's been described as a burden, but in fact, they're a wildly successful and contributing population. And again, we're talking about a very, very big group, and not mentioning the kind of very high-profile refugee entrepreneurs like, Sergey Brin, for example, or other famous refugees in the past, whether people like Albert Einstein or Enrico Fermi or Madeleine Albright or Henry Kissinger, or on and on. So why you would want to, first of all, you're saving lives, which is extraordinarily important. But second of all, it's a program that's benefited the United States, dramatically over the years, and it's the most secure program in terms of admissions and the most well-vetted group coming into the country. So, I have no idea why you would want to attack this program in the way that it's been attacked.
I'm also surprised that there's not much stronger pushback from the Democrats on this. In other words, highlighting some of the things that you just mentioned, because when the president comes out or the attorney general comes out and they say all of these things, quite frankly, they're not true. And I just don't understand why there's not more pushback.
They're not true, and it's a shame, and this is something that's, relatively new. I mean, it was Ronald Reagan that said that, who vowed in 1981 to continue America's tradition as a land that welcomes people from other countries, and to share in the responsibility of welcoming and resettling those who flee persecution. So this is a program that's had, fairly broad, and bipartisan support over the years. And then all of a sudden, it's, they've been, in recent years, been attacked as a burden and a threat. And it isn't true, in fact. And instead of, I think, a program that was always regarded as a bellwether of our values and a way to project our values to the world, it's regarded now as a kind of as a problem program, which couldn't be further than the truth. And I for the life of me don't know why politicians aren't speaking about this more. I can tell you that people are voting with their feet in terms of volunteering to assist refugees all over the country. I mean, the thousands of people that have come out to volunteer to help refugees during a time of difficulty and when they're under attack is really extraordinary. And maybe when politicians understand that that's really the reaction of the country to refugees, as opposed to kind of, select protests or whatever, they'll be more likely to support this important program.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also say we're abdicating leadership on the global stage. How can our policies influence the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that you have to recognize is that the United States has always been the leader in refugee resettlement. And refugee resettlement to third countries is for particularly vulnerable people that are at real risk wherever they find themselves, whether it's in a refugee camp or in an urban setting or whatever. And so for the United States, at a time when there's record numbers of forcibly displaced people, there's 68 million forcibly displaced people, and 25.4 million of them are refugees, to pull back from refugee protection, it's an extraordinary message to the world and to others that, responsibility sharing is not important to us. And so I think that really, really hurts at a time when the world leaders and the nations of the world are talking about creating a greater sense of responsibility sharing to resolve this immense crisis. And the other way, frankly, it hurts is that if you look historically, at different times in history where there was immense crises like these, like, for example, following World War II with the displaced people, or after the Vietnam conflict, or after the Cuban Revolution, saving the lives of those vulnerable people and pulling other states together to address crises of that magnitude was regarded as something that was centrally important to the United States, and it reflected U.S. values and showed the world what we stood for. And, by contrast, you have this administration basically trying to, dismantle this refugee program and the infrastructure that supports it. So the message couldn't be more different and couldn't be more damaging.
Yeah, and doing so without any basis, really. You've said before that immigrants are part of our DNA as a country. How do you see these new policies changing us? What does that do to our DNA?
Yeah, I think that the United States has always been a country that at its best was bound by a commitment to shared ideals. And people could come to the United States and be accepted if they contributed and if they shared those ideals and were committed to building the country with others, and like basic ideals like, justice and rights and due process and opportunity. And it didn't matter what religion you were or what race or ethnicity. What mattered was your commitment to those civic ideals and of course, to the institutions that safeguard those ideals. And now we're seeing an attack on that vision, I think, and it's really a totally different kind of country that's being posited. It's a country that's based on characteristics where membership is based on characteristics that people can't change or they shouldn't have to change. Things like race, religion, ethnicity, or a very exclusive kind of sense of culture. And that's really changing us for the worse. It's unrecognizable. That vision is unrecognizable as the United States, I think. And so I think that's really the risk. It's a lot more like a vision, an Eastern European vision, a Russian vision, or a Hungarian vision, or whatever, than it is the way that the U.S. has always viewed itself.
We're speaking with Donald Kerwin, Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies, on today's edition of the America's Democrats podcast. Don, we want to talk about the story that has dominated the headlines for weeks, the separation of families at our borders. As someone who has committed a career to helping those who come to our country for refuge, what has it been like to watch this story unfold?
Well, I think for me, it's been disgusting and troubling and I think heartbreaking too. You have a administration that's somehow consistently trying to project strength, not by aiding people in need, but by putting children in cages and by attacking programs that protect people in need, whether they're the refugee program or the asylum program or temporary protected status or the Central American Minors program. And so, what do you do about a vision like that where people are trying to show, the administration is trying to show its strength in the weakest of ways, in the most pitiful of ways, but really hurting people in the meantime, and literally putting children in cages and separating them from their parents. I don't think it can get much lower. I hope it can't get much lower than that. And even Sessions using kind of providing a bogus religious justification for doing that. It's really extraordinary, and it really doesn't seem at all consistent with the kind of country that most of us want to live in.
Yeah, these actions are quite the opposite from the practices of any religion I've ever known. So I just don't understand. I don't understand the arguments. I mean, I don't understand what they're doing. I don't understand their explanations because, well, it's all. None of it's based on fact, and it's pretty distressing. But of course, you have people that are appealing to the base by saying, "Oh, it's just like summer camp." And it's not cages; it's just fencing. I mean, really, we're supposed to take that?
Yeah, that's what I think that they are doing, and I don't know who the base is exactly because I think so many people are disgusted by this.
I hope.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so too. But if not, then I wish that they would be, and I wish they'd look into their consciences because these are not like how has Trump described them? He's described them as vermin and people that are infesting the country and invaders. And I mean, this is all very dehumanizing language, and you couldn't possibly support a program like this or an initiative like this if you really honored people's dignity and recognized their rights and recognized their equality and the fact that what's important to these people is unification of their families and kind of better lives and protection, living secure, safe, productive lives. And here in the United States, and yet they come and they're being separated and their children are being caged.
Do you see resolution to this issue, the separation of families, with recent court orders?
I don't. I think that, what the executive order has basically done, Trump's executive order, which, like most of what this administration does, is very ill-conceived and seat of the pants, is it would basically unify children with their parents, but in detention centers, and that so clearly violates the Flores Agreement, which requires children to be released from detention without unnecessary delay, and that's been determined to be detention with family members for no more than 20 days. So, what Trump is trying to do is, and the Justice Department is now trying to do, is to modify the order from that case to allow for child detention for more than 20 days and probably a lot more than 20 days. And I just think that, this agreement or this order, it seems to violate all the pillars of that particular case and that settlement, because it could lead to the long-term detention of children, which would certainly, stunt their development and really ought to be seen as a form of child abuse. And that decision also was about placing children in the least restrictive setting available to them. And obviously a detention center is not that. And it runs afoul of the settlement's release preferences, which start with releasing people to non-detained parents. So anyway, I don't see that this is going to be happily resolved and kind of, that the executive order is going to be upheld under this case.
Mm-hmm. Well, and not to mention, we won't go into it now because we just don't have the time, but the psychological effect on these kids, the long-term psychological effect on these kids. I mean, I can't even imagine.
You're exactly right. I mean, and there's a lot of, or a growing body of literature, and people are really stepping forward to say that this is not going to be over when they're reunified. But the truth is, a number of these kids aren't going to be reunified with parents for a long, long time because the parents have subsequently been deported.
Mm-hmm. Before we let you go, many of our listeners are looking for ways to support immigrants right now. What do you say to them?
Make sure that your representatives are opposed to these policies, that they're in favor of a robust refugee protection system, resettlement of refugees in the United States. They have to vote in November, of course. They can support refugees in their own communities. In fact, the outpouring of support to refugee resettlement agencies has been overwhelming in many communities. And to really look critically at claims like some of these extraordinary measures that have been adopted by this administration and never adopted before by any other administration, that they actually further national security. They don't. They don't further national security, very far from it.
Don Kerwin, Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Don, we appreciate your time as always, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why everyone should reread the Declaration of Independence. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Get ready, America. Here we go to war. Generalissimo Trump, who's known de guerre as El Donaldo, the mucho macho presidente of the USA, is personally directing the hostilities in this assault on, surprise, the USA. Well, not every American. He's specifically mounting a war on our country's poor people, though he euphemistically calls it a war of liberation. The purpose, he says, is to, quote, free poor families from food stamps, Medicaid, housing assistance, and America's other programs that alleviate poverty. Welfare, he snarls, as he and his militant lieutenants conduct ruthless slash-and-burn forays to defund and destroy such benefits. Their rationale is that eliminating anti-poverty assistance will not only save billions of tax dollars and reduce the federal budget deficit, but it'll also provide a moral incentive for poor people to get jobs and work their way up to prosperity, like El Donaldo and his billionaire buddies did. Actually, Trump inherited a real estate fortune from his daddy Fred, and he expanded it by relying on billions of dollars in government subsidies, tax breaks, and special favors. As for working, most poor people already have jobs, but the miserly pay of those jobs mire them in poverty and drudgery. Even more significant, the vicious, laissez-faire-land sense of moral superiority possessed by pampered political elites like Trump lead them to be intentionally cruel to the poor. This is Jim Hightower saying he, his cabinet of multimillionaires, and such coke-headed congressional ideologues as GOP House Speaker Paul Ryan and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell are so disdainful of the needy that they have a perverse impulse to punish them, as though being poor is not punishment enough. It's said that war is hell, but their war on the poor is truly satanic.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Danielle Allen is one of our nation's leading democracy theorists. In an interview from our archives, she speaks to the lesson we still need to learn from the Declaration of Independence, that equality is the essential partner of liberty. And we say hello to Danielle Allen, director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, and the author of Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality. Dr. Danielle Allen, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And, how would you rank the Declaration of Independence among the great documents of the Western world?
Oh, gosh, that's a great question. I think it's right up there at the very, very top. So I'm not one to count exact numbers, but I think it's a must-read. One of those desert island classics. If you had to take something with you, you could take nothing else. The Declaration would be on my list. Okay.
Now, your take in the book is that we usually assume that liberty is the Declaration's gift to free people, but you make the point that liberty is impossible without equality. Why has equality been given such short shrift?
That's a great question. So liberty and equality are the two founding concepts of democracy. They're twinned. I think of them as Siamese twins, really. You have to have that egalitarian bond in a community to defend liberty in the first place for ourselves individually and for ourselves collectively as a community. In the middle of the 20th century, a lot of folks on the libertarian side of things started working really hard on the concept of liberty, digging back into philosophy, disseminating key texts, Smith, Hayek, things like that. And so I think over the last half century, this country's had a much deeper conversation about the liberty concept than we've had about the equality concept. And for that reason, I think that equality concept has fallen a bit behind.
How do we balance that? How do we bring that back into balance?
Well, honestly, I think a great way to start is by reading the Declaration of Independence. I mean, it's only 1,337 words, and I'm astonished by how few people have read it from start to finish. But when you do, you realize that the equality concept is woven all the way through. So not just in the famous sentences everybody knows, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, but it's in the first sentence, when the colonists declare that they're going to assume their separate and equal place on the world stage in relationship to other powers. It comes back at the end when they all declare that they're gonna commit themselves to sharing their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor with each other mutually. The idea of mutuality is an idea of equality. It comes out in the middle of the Declaration when they share with us their list of grievances, which in fact they built in a very egalitarian way. They even put ads in all the newspapers throughout the colonies asking people to share their stories about what had happened to them with the British. So all the way through there's an argument about the place of equality in building a community and in achieving decisions that are good for the whole community. And so I think even starting with that text, it's a terrific way to reintroduce oneself to the philosophical content of equality.
We're speaking with Danielle Allen, director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University and the author of Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality. How should we look at such an eloquent and revolutionary statement of equality, given that at least one of its main authors was a slaveholder?
It's really important to recognize that the Declaration is the product of many voices. I think of it as a polyphonic text. And we give Jefferson a lot of credit. He deserves a lot of credit as a key draftsman, but he was by no means alone in that work. And so people don't realize that John Adams of Massachusetts was critical to the coming to be of the Declaration. He and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia are the people who really turned all the wheels and cogs of politics to make a declaration happen in the first place. They're the ones who got the resolution going that there should be a declaration and got a committee set up, got Jefferson elected to it, and so forth. But the key thing there is that Adams was an anti-slavery person. He never held slaves. He was against slavery. He wrote an important text that was published in April of 1776, arguing that happiness should be the key concept around which governments organize themselves. That happiness concept, it could not be more important because what it did was displace the Virginians' property concept. The Virginians wanted and did in the Virginia Declaration of Rights use a property concept as part of a way of defending slavery. By keeping that out of the Declaration, which was surely Adams' contribution, he made sure that the Declaration itself could not count as a defense of slavery.
Now, while we look back at the Declaration of Independence as an almost sacred text advocating equality and liberty, wasn't it really an appeal by rich white male merchants who simply wanted to gain seats in Parliament?
So again, I think that it's a much bigger, broader text than that. I find it really astonishing, actually, that when you dig into the events that preceded the Declaration, you find towns all over the colonies holding meetings to talk about what's been happening to them with Britain. And, literally towns would put up posters and say, everybody gather in Farmer Smith's field on Sunday at 3 p.m. And then you had royal governors punishing people for trying to gather like that. And those gathering of townspeople brought all different kinds of people together, merchants, yes, but farmers as well. And we even have places where we can see women participating in some of these conversations. So it's a bigger, richer story than we're used to telling.
Mm-hmm.
Go
ahead, sorry.
Well, for example, people are used to understanding that those kinds of meetings happened in, say, Massachusetts, which had a very strong democratic town culture. But those kinds of meetings happened in Georgia as well, which people think of as sort of more oriented towards an aristocratic system. So there really were deep democratic roots operating as the conversations that built to the Declaration of Independence.
Mm-hmm. Could the Revolutionary War have succeeded without those 1,377 words?
I don't think it could have, actually. I think they were key on a number of levels. So the process of coming to decide to declare independence is the process by which, in my view, the very disparate, diverse peoples of the colonies, in fact, became one people. And that notion of being one people is in the first sentence of the Declaration. That wasn't an obvious thing. They were from different parts of Europe. They weren't all even English speakers and so forth. There was even religious diversity among them. So they had to become one people in order to win. That process of deciding to declare independence and writing a text together was critical to that. Of course, the text also obviously had what might straightforwardly be called propagandistic purposes. They wanted to get France on their side. They had to convince France that they counted as a nation, as a state, and that is one of the fundamental purposes of the Declaration, was to make that case. And they succeeded. So they convinced the French, at least. That made a big difference in terms of winning the revolution ultimately.
Well, and and much of the Declaration reads like a count-by-count indictment of King George, but politically speaking, weren't the real villains the Prime Minister and Parliament, or does it even make any difference now?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and I think it is one of the trickiest questions. So there's a real silence about Parliament in the Declaration. So when you read that list of grievances, there's even one in the middle where they describe the king as having combined with others. So it's a very oblique and vague phrase, but the others that they're referring to there, is exactly members of Parliament. So why did they leave Parliament out? I think there are two reasons. One, because the symbol of a tyrant was a very powerful symbol for mobilizing people. So in that regard, it was a rhetorical move. But I think the other reason is that they were actually, to the best of their ability, trying to keep the British people, sort of those who were not immediately part of the monarchy, possibly open to being on their side. In other words, I think they were trying even to sort of drive a wedge between the king and his people in England. In other words, I think sowing seeds of republicanism there too. So it was a kind of canny strategic move, I think, to put all the focus on the king instead of throwing Parliament in with him.
Kind of a double-edged sword type of document then.
It's a powerful document, absolutely. So in my book, I make the case, yes, it's this incredibly important philosophic text, but it's also actually just a kind of very pragmatic political memo that's getting some work done. And one needs to see how both of those things are happening at the same time. And I suppose the other thing I think that's important about that is that to see how much they believed that words can do political work, and to remember the power of language and its ability to help us make new kinds of worlds, help generate new kinds of actions. And that's the power each and every one of us has. So I really think that the idea of equality comes down to that core capacity we each have to use language, to shape worlds, to make judgments. And so the amazing thing about the document is that it's doing exactly the thing that it says everybody has the capacity to do.
Perhaps this is a good time to point out to folks that if you haven't read it, you should go and read the Declaration of Independence. And even if you have, maybe it's probably a good time to go back and read it again, and maybe we can kind of set our own modern-day political ship straight again.
Absolutely, but let me just give you a little tip when you go do that, because odds are if you go to read the Declaration now, you're going to go log on to the page on the National Archives, and you'll get that transcription there. And you know what? There's actually an error in that National Archives transcription. So I've been trying to talk to them about this, and we'll see if I make any progress. But The important second sentence, which lists the self-evident truths, is a three-part sentence. So first we get the notion that all men are created equal and endowed with the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Then we get the idea that governments are instituted in order to protect these rights. And then we get the idea that when those rights are not being protected by government, we have the right to alter and abolish in order to secure our safety and happiness. So the whole sentence of the truth moves from our individual rights of life, liberty, and happiness, pursuit of happiness, to a collective right to collectively secure our safety and happiness as a whole community. But in the transcription that you'll see on the website there's actually a period after the first truth, as if it stops at our individual rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But the sentence doesn't stop there. It goes all the way through from individual to collective to what we do together, and that's a really important part of the Declaration.
I find it astounding that it's inaccurate there on that website, but
it's a long and it's a complicated story for how that happened, but it's the case. If you go look at all the manuscript that Jefferson wrote, the manuscripts that Adams wrote, the manuscript record that's in the Continental Congress's official record, there's no period there.
Okay. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Peter Ogburn, sitting in for Bill Press, talks with Kaili Joy Gray of Shareblue Media.
Joining me in studio is managing editor at Shareblue, Kaili Joy Gray. How are you?
I mean, it's all relative, right?
I've had to learn to stop saying that to people. Right. How's it going? How are you? Because it's just like...
How the hell do you think I am? Yeah. All things told.
Yeah. I mean, we live in hell. Other than that, I'm great.
I mean, it's nice weather outside. I guess there's that.
Oh, but... I appreciate your optimism. Shareblue.com, Shareblue.com. Tell us a little bit about Shareblue really quickly, because we've never had you on the show.
Oh, well, I'm happy to be here. Shareblue Media is progressive media that exists to cover the elected officials and regular everyday Americans who are doing everything they can to fight back against the Trump administration and the Republican agenda that is trying to destroy truth, justice, and the American way.
I love it. Let's check it out, shareblue.com. I would imagine you have some thoughts on the retiring of Justice Anthony Kennedy yesterday.
They are some very not family-friendly thoughts. Those are my first thoughts.
Yeah, same. Same. Let me ask you this, though, because I think Shareblue is sort of a great site for Democrats that want to fight back, Democrats that want to find things that they can accomplish in the age of Trump. Can Democrats, are they going to be able to stop this next nominee?
Well, it's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
But, here's the thing that I hold on to, late at night alone in my bed when I'm scared.
Optimism. Here it comes. Here comes your optimism.
On election night, the worst night ever, when we all assumed that's it. That's the end of America as we know it. That's the end of Obamacare. That'll be gone, day one. But it's still here, and so are we.
Yeah.
And that fact alone gives me some comfort in the darkest of days in thinking that this Republican Party that is in control of everything now, everything, is so freaking incompetent.
Yeah.
And here they are. They finally have their chance to destroy everything that normal people hold dear, and they can't get their acts together to do it. And so I hope that they will have a harder time accomplishing another goal that they have, because they're actually very bad at being villains. They're terrible, but they're not very good at it. That's my hope. That said,
yeah.
There are more of them than there are of us in Congress, in the Senate, and the numbers are not in our favor right now. I know that, we're looking at some of the senators who have said that protecting health care is very important to them, regardless of party. And if they believe that, and if that is true, and yes, Susan Collins, I'm talking to you. Lisa Murkowski, what up?
Yeah.
If they believe that it is important to protect healthcare and that it is especially important to protect basic fundamental healthcare rights for women, hey ladies, then they have a golden opportunity here to do that and to make sure that this Supreme Court does not get turned into, Operation Rescue.
Okay, let me ask you this, because I promise I'm not trying to be all bleak all the time, but what power do they have over the Supreme Court actually making that decision? Because the way I see it, because I'm sort of a pessimist, the way I see it, it could go all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, let's just say, overturns Roe versus Wade. The Republicans go, hey, we didn't do this. This was Supreme Court. This is the law of the land. Obviously we disagree with this, but blah, 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 blah. I can see that happening.
Well, they have an incredible power, which is that they have a say in the next Supreme Court justice.
Yeah.
And they can say yes or no. Mm-hmm. It's just that simple. And Donald Trump made clear from the very beginning during his campaign that he had an agenda for who he would appoint to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And the number one thing he said was he wanted to appoint somebody who, Mike Pence fantasizes about at night. And somebody who
that could go a lot of different directions, Kaili.
I mean, you know what I'm saying.
Yes, but yes.
So, he said that somebody who would overturn basic fundamental rights for women was a priority for him. And all of the judges he has put out there on his list, his little wish list, have been carefully vetted by the worst scumbags of America who have gotten 2 thumbs up for, yes, that's our kind of scum.
Yeah.
And
that's our scum.
So
put that on the bumper sticker.
So we know what he's looking for.
Yeah.
And that means if we know, so do they. And those senators can say, no, actually, we're not going to say yes to that kind of justice, because that kind of justice is going to try to undo the things that the majority of Americans support, like healthcare, abortion rights, marriage equality, worker rights, environmental protections. Should I go on?
No, I know. That's enough, please. It's somebody made a point on Twitter this morning about how this type of show that we're doing today is probably making Republicans just so happy, because this is the whole liberal tears, right? The governing by triggering the libs.
The snowflakes are melting.
Exactly. It's like they just love this stuff. But God damn it, this is just too important. So let me switch gears a little bit, because over the weekend, Sarah Huckabee Sanders went to try and go eat dinner at a nice farm-to-table restaurant.
Yes.
And she was politely asked to leave after she was served a meal, which she then took to Twitter and said, yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And so I've been sort of having this ongoing conversation this week about political civility. And I think it applies, by the way, to the situation that we're in with the Supreme Court, because I think that the reason that Barack Obama did not get his constitutionally allowed pick on the Supreme Court was because of political civility and norms. Is political civility dead?
I mean, I don't know who these people are and what rock they've been living under.
Yeah.
Because I am old enough to remember, and I'm not that old, the days before Donald Trump, when there was plenty of incivility, a bunch of crazy white people running around this country saying the black president can't possibly be an American. I don't consider that civil.
Fair.
I remember the days when George Bush was still president and his vice president said something really nasty on the floor of the Senate to another senator that, again, not family friendly.
Not family friendly.
Was that civil?
An act that he asked Patrick Leahy to do in defiance of God's will.
Right.
Not something that you were able to do. But yes, we know what you're talking about.
So, I mean, the idea that, this was a lovely little country until the mean libs came along and interrupted Sarah Huckabee Sanders from enjoying a meal that, frankly, she could afford to skip.
Sure.
Sure. It's okay, sure, if you were born yesterday and don't remember anything at all. But the idea that somehow it is more uncivil to protest a public official than it is to rip crying infants from their breastfeeding mothers is not a standard that I can understand, and it's not a standard that we should consider an American value.
I agree with you. I think that civility has been dead with the Republicans for a long, long time. But I do think that Barack Obama and part of his message, right, of trying to be the bigger man, trying to rise above.
Be a grown-up.
Yeah. Act like a decent human being.
Yeah.
But like his adherence to the norms, I think really kind of, I should say this, adherence to the norms in the face of an opposition that just threw the norms out the window. So it's sort of like you're playing against a stacked deck.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing that's amazing, now there's this whole effort, right, to trigger the libs. But you have never seen a more triggered group of people than when we elected a black president.
Oh, my God.
And they lost their freaking minds. And, they invented the Tea Party, which is just a group of really angry Republicans. And
white Republicans, but yes.
Yes. I mean,
yes.
the Tea Party, it turned out, was more Republican than your average Republican.
Yeah.
And they were so triggered, these precious little snowflakes, that there was a black man and his lovely wife with really nice arms and his adorable, sweet children who didn't actually travel around the world and cause international embarrassments like, hey, Bush girls. And, they were so triggered by this and so upset that they just wanted to burn it all down. And they made that very clear. Mitch McConnell would say the entire point of being in the Senate right now is to stop Barack Obama.
Yeah.
No, dude, that's not actually your job. Check the Constitution.
Yeah.
And
you have a job description. It's pretty clear.
Every Republican who ran against Obama in 2012 and lost said the whole point for them wasn't about America or the American people. It was about trying to stick it to Barack Obama and humiliate that uppity black president. And, it failed, but they've been so bitter and so upset about it. And Barack Obama, bless his heart, wanted to believe that somewhere out there is a better America. And that was his biggest mistake, because it turns out there isn't.
Okay. You took it exactly where I wanted to go. So now that we've seen who they truly are, I'm trying to figure out a more delicate way of asking, is America worth saving? But my
How much time you got?
But my point is, have Democrats gotten the message? Have they moved on from that message of civility that Barack Obama tried to preach? Have Democrats sort of said, like, okay, gloves are off. You want to fight? We'll bring an actual fight to you. We'll bring a cage match to you.
I think in a way, yes. And the reason I say that is because if you think back to the olden days when George W. Bush was appointed to the presidency by his dad's friends on the Supreme Court, Democrats tried to be the adults. And they tried to say, okay, that was so effed up, but this is America. Mm-hmm. We must come together. We must move forward. We have a president. We don't like the guy, but we're going to try to do our jobs and work with him. And they were also cowed after 9/11 into doing whatever Republicans said. And, Democrats out there in America were like, what happened to our party?
Yeah.
Who represents us? The difference this time around, when another illegitimate president assumed the White House, thanks Putin and other people,
take your pick,
is that Democrats didn't say, well, what's done is done. Let's be the adults here. They said, you know what? Screw that.
Yeah.
Screw that. Screw this guy. Screw this party. Screw everything. You're not getting your wish list, pal. And that is a huge difference to me.
Yeah. That
gives me some hope that the difference between Democrats of, say, 2002 and Democrats of, 2018 is that they understand that, you can't work with these people.
Yeah.
They're nihilists.
I want to. Yesterday was a roller coaster of emotions, to say the least. Because when we did the show yesterday, there's obviously always bad news to talk about, but there was some encouraging news when we talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who beat Joe Crowley in New York. And she spoke yesterday about some very strong progressive ideology. We have a couple of clips from her. First of all, she was asked if you do get elected, and all signs seem to point to she will be elected, she will become a member of Congress, will you impeach Donald Trump?
We are at that point. It's unfortunate, but I believe that we are at that point.
And he should be impeached.
Yes.
Yes. And she also talked about a new sort of rallying cry for progressive Democrats. We need to abolish ICE.
We can find a way for people to safely enter this country and be documented and not have to experience the continued injustice of the separation of families at our border.
So compare that to some of the Democratic senators yesterday who were like, well, we're just going to have to wait and see who the president appoints to the Supreme Court before we decide. No. The answer is no. We're going to stop you at everything.
Well, so, yes, some Democrats are trying to, again, be the adults and
shame on them.
Shame on them, right?
How overrated is that?
For thinking that, again, the Constitution actually says what their job description is, and their job description, according to the Constitution, is to govern this country.
Yeah.
But, I've been heartened to see some Democrats, including the minority leader, Chuck Schumer, say, hey, guys, remember in 2016 when Mitch McConnell invented a rule out of thin air, the McConnell rule, that says you can't appoint a Supreme Court justice in an election year? Guess what the year is, dude?
Yeah.
It's an election year. And hey, if you need to wait until the voters speak in November before you can take any action, voters have a lot to say this November, and I'm pretty sure that what voters have to say is not going to be very friendly to the Republicans.
Yeah.
So, what's good for the goose is good for the GOP. And I think that those Democrats, Schumer, the most important one, he's the leader, right?
Yeah.
Saying, you know what? Screw you. We're going to take your rule. We're going to shove it right back down your throats. And we'll just see what happens when we take the Senate back from you guys. That's encouraging. I encourage that tactic. I am excited about that tactic. I think that, I don't know if it can work, but I think Democrats need to employ every tactic they have. So there's no justice here who would be acceptable. Because of that, because you can't appoint a justice this year. Sorry, that's the new rule you guys came up with.
Yeah.
And anybody who Trump puts forward is going to be some far-right, wingnut, radical nut job who wants to tear up the Constitution. And on those grounds, that's also unacceptable. And that's where you would hope to see certain Republican senators that we know are out there and say they care about certain issues would say that's not acceptable to me.
I want to play this clip from Orrin Hatch because there was a lot of hand-wringing from Democrats about the whole McConnell rule, right? This election year, and somebody came out and was just like, oh, I'd like to see how they're going to defend this. Pretty easily, actually. Here's Orrin Hatch.
Well, because they're not in control now, and they're the minority, and frankly, I think the American people have been pretty happy with the choices by the Republicans.
So pretty shamelessly is how they're going to get out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing thing for him to say, right? Because he's basically like, hey, screw you.
Yeah.
And also, we're just going to pretend that the American people like what we're doing.
Yeah.
Which they don't.
They don't.
I mean, the American people are so freaking pissed off that the American people have been showing up in these incredibly red districts across America that Republicans won by 10, 20, 30, 40 points in past elections that went for Trump by double digits and throwing the bums out of office in special elections in districts that were so Republican, Democrats wouldn't even run there.
Yeah.
So please tell me about how the American people are like, yes, Orrin Hatch, we got you. We love what you're doing to us.
But you know what, though? They could get away with it.
They might. They very well could.
Your optimism. I appreciate your optimism.
But, here's our option.
Talk me down, please.
Okay. Here are our options realistically.
Okay.
We can say, holy crap, we're screwed. Might as well just go back to bed.
That's me. Well, no, go ahead.
Or we can say, holy crap, we're probably screwed, but, we should still do whatever we can think of to stop it.
Yeah.
Because it might not work, but giving up, I don't see that as an option.
Yeah.
And, throughout history, you have incredible stories of small groups of people overcoming, Goliath. So it can be done. It is possible. It's not impossible. It's just really hard. It's even unlikely, but we don't have any choice. We can't just give up and go back to bed.
No, you're right. I mean, you are right. And look, crazier things have happened. We ended up with Donald Trump as president. No one saw that, and not many people saw that coming. So, like, oh boy, I just I
can't think of a third alternative, and that's the issue for me, is that I feel like I have to still get up every single day and do whatever tiny, small thing I can do in my corner of the internet, in my little part of the world, to say no. Because at least we have to put it on the history books that there were people in this country who said no.
Yeah.
And, you know, when they look back on whatever happened to that nice country, America, we need people to know that there were those of us who said no. We voted against this terrible, rotten, skin sack excuse for a human being. And, you know, more of us voted against him than for him. And we took to the streets and we rallied like hell and we threw out his accomplices and we did everything that we could to stop it. We didn't succeed in every case, but we tried. That's what we have to keep doing.
I think that's probably the best message that we could hear right now. I want to switch gears because I want to get this story in. The White House has been looking for a new communications director, and it looks as though they might have found him. It's a name you probably recognize. His name is Bill Shine. You guys remember that name? Bill Shine used to be at Fox News, had a very, very strong hand in forming the way that Fox News spoke to conservatives. He also helped cover up multiple sexual harassment / sexual assault allegations at Fox News before he left in disgrace. But he's going to get a second shot at the highest office in the land. In the White House. He's going to be communications director. Talk about political civility. They just don't care. This guy is a snake of the highest order.
I mean, when you're going to Fox to hire people to, you know, do your messaging for you, you're just saying, we want the worst kind of people who are unapologetic liars, who just make stuff up.
Constantly.
All the time. And that's who you want to be in charge of your messaging. So, I mean, it's not surprising. Of course, Trump wants Fox News to be running his messaging. I mean, of course he does.
Yeah.
I'm amazed that he hasn't hired one of, you know, the little Fox blonde girls to replace Sarah Huckabee Sanders yet. I feel like that's probably coming.
We'll see that happen. There's time for that.
I mean, of course he wants to bring in Fox.
Yeah.
Water is wet, right?
Right.
But, you know, the funny thing to me is that Donald Trump is so bad at people that even when he has somebody he thinks he likes, remember when he loved John Kelly and would call him my general?
Yeah.
Like, he can bring in whoever he wants, give him a few months, and he'll hate that guy too. So it's kind of like, okay, Bill Shine, you go ahead and you head in there and you think you're going to be the guy who can control the things that come out of Donald Trump's mouth. Good luck with that, buddy.
It's unwinnable. It's unwinnable. He's going to find himself. I mean, look, working with talent is one thing. Don't I know it? Working with talent is one thing, but working with a guy like Donald Trump is something completely different. And I think the scariest thing that I read was, you know, the first year of the Trump administration was kind of a mess. They didn't get a ton of stuff done. It was pretty disorganized. And a lot of that was due to the fact that Donald Trump didn't necessarily know what he was doing, and he was a little intimidated by the job. That's all gone now.
True, but, you know, he still doesn't know what he's doing. He just doesn't care what
anymore.
People say to him.
Right.
And here's the amazing thing. You know, Bill Shine comes from Fox News. Fox News is an incredibly disciplined organization. They put their talking points out to the entire team every day, and those are the exact talking points that come out of every single mouth all day long.
Say what you will about Fox News. They are tight as a drum.
Absolutely.
They know what they're doing.
That's not going to be the case with Donald Trump because, as we know from every single person who's worked with him at the White House, including his favorite generals, you know, 4-star Marine generals cannot control this man, they can write notes to him in all caps that say, "Do not congratulate."
You remember that?
Putin. And Trump is like, congratulate Putin. Got it. So, they can't control him from tweeting things where it's like, there's Robert Mueller, like, cool, there's another obstruction of justice issue to look into because he tweeted something stupid. So, yeah, sure, Bill Shine, you're going to go in there and you're going to be the one who can implement that Fox discipline of messaging of Donald Trump. And 6 months from now, we can be sitting here talking about, hey, remember when they were excited about Bill Shine and now he's on his way out too.
Managing editor at shareblue.com, Kaili Joy Gray. Follow her on Twitter at Kaili Joy, Kaili Joy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Donald Kerwin, Danielle Allen, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.